Positioning the battle for your mind. Chapter 3. Getting into the mind. In our over-communicated society, the paradox is that nothing is more important than communication. With communication going for you, anything is possible. Without it, nothing is possible. No matter how talented and ambitious you may be. What's called luck is usually an outgrowth of successful communication. Saying the right things to the right person at the right time. Finding what the NASA people in Houston call a window in space. Positioning is an organized system for finding a window in the mind. It is based on the concept that communication can only take place at the right time and under the right circumstances. The easy way into the mind. The easy way to get into a person's mind is to be first. You can demonstrate the validity of this principle by asking yourself a few simple questions. What's the name of the first person to fly solo across the North Atlantic? Charles Lindbergh, right? Now, what's the name of the second person to fly solo across the North Atlantic? Not so easy to answer, is it? What's the name of the first person to walk on the moon? Neil Armstrong, of course. What's the name of the second? What's the name of the highest mountain in the world? Mount Everest in the Himalayas, right? What's the name of the second highest mountain in the world? What's the name of the first person you ever made love with? What's the name of the second? The first person, the first mountain, the first company to occupy the position in the mind is going to be awfully hard to dislodge. Kodak in photography, Kleenex in tissue, Xerox in plain paper copiers, Hertz in rent-a-cars, Coca-Cola. General in electric. The first thing you need to fix your message indelibly in the mind is not a message at all. It's a mind. An innocent mind. A mind that has not been burnished by someone else's brand. What's true in business is true in nature too. Imprinting is the term animal biologists use to describe the first encounter between a newborn animal and its natural mother. It takes only a few seconds to fix indelibly in the memory of the young animal the identity of its parent. You might think all ducks look alike, but even a day-old duckling will always recognize its mother, no matter how much you mix up the flock. Well, that's not quite true. If the imprinting process is interrupted by the substitution of a dog or cat or even a human being, the duckling will treat the substitute as its natural mother. No matter how different the creature looks. Falling in love is a similar phenomenon. While people are more selective than ducks, they're not nearly as selective as you might think. What counts most is receptivity. Two people must meet in a situation in which both are receptive to the idea. Both must have open windows. That is, neither is deeply in love with someone else. Marriage, as a human institution, depends on the concept of first being better than best. And so does business. If you want to be successful in love or in business, you must appreciate the importance of getting into the mind first. You build brand loyalty in a supermarket the same way you build mate loyalty in a marriage. You get there first and then be careful not to give them a reason to switch. The hard way into the mind. And what if your name is not Charles or Neil or Kleenex or Hertz? What if someone else got into your prospect's mind first? The hard way to get into a person's mind is second. Second is nowhere. What's the largest selling book ever published? Also the first book ever printed with movable type. The Bible, of course. And the second largest selling book ever published? Who knows? New York is the largest cargo port in the United States. But which one is second? Would you believe Hampton Roads, Virginia? It's true. Who was the second person to fly solo across the North Atlantic? Amelia Earhart was not the second person to fly the North Atlantic solo, although she was the first woman to do it. Now then, who was the second woman? If you didn't get into the mind of your prospect first, personally, politically, or corporately, then you have a positioning problem. In a physical contest, the odds favor the fastest horse, the strongest team, the best player. The race isn't always to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, said Damon Runyon, but that's the way to bet. Not so in a mental contest. In a mental battle the odds favor the first person, the first product, the first politician to get into the mind of the prospect. In advertising, the first product to establish the position has an enormous advantage. Xerox, Polaroid, Bubble Yum, to name a few more examples. In advertising, it's best to have the best product in your particular field. But it's even better to be first. Love might be wonderful the second time around, but nobody cares who the second person to fly solo across the North Atlantic was. even if that person was a better pilot. There are positioning strategies to deal with the problem of being number 2 or number 3 or even number 203. See Chapter 8, Repositioning the Competition. But first, make sure you can't find something to be first in. It's better to be a big fish in a small pond, and then increase the size of the pond, than to be a small fish in a big pond. Advertising learns the lesson. The advertising industry is learning the Lindbergh lesson the hard way. With the magic of money and enough bright people, some companies feel that any marketing program should succeed. The wreckage is still washing up on the beach. DuPont's Core Fam, Gabling Earth's beer, the Convair 880, Vote toothpaste, Handy Andy cleaner. The world will never be the same again, and neither will the advertising business. Not that a lot of companies haven't tried. Every drugstore and supermarket is filled with shelf after shelf of half-successful brands. The manufacturers of these Me Too products cling to the hope that they can develop a brilliant advertising campaign which will lift their offspring into the winner's circle. Meanwhile, they hang in there with coupons, deals, point-off purchase displays. But profits are hard to come by, and that brilliant advertising campaign, even if it comes, doesn't ever seem to turn the brand around. No wonder management people turn skeptical when the subject of advertising comes up. It's enough to drive an advertising person into the soft ice cream business. The chaos in the marketplace is a reflection of the fact that advertising just doesn't work the way it used to. But old traditional ways of doing things die hard. There's no reason why advertising can't do the job, say the defenders of the status quo, as long as the product is good, the plan is sound, and the commercials are creative. But they overlook one big, loud reason: the marketplace itself. The noise level today is far too high. Messages prepared in the old, traditional ways have no hope of being successful in today's over-communicated society. To understand how we got to where we are today, it might be helpful to take a quick look at recent communication history. The product era. Back in the 50s, advertising was in the product era. In a lot of ways, these were the good old days when the better mousetrap and some money to promote it were all you needed. It was a time when advertising people focused their attention on product features and customer benefits. They looked for, as Rosser Reeves called it, the unique selling proposition. But in the late 50s, technology started to rear its ugly head. It became more and more difficult to establish that USP. The end of the product era came with an avalanche of Me Too products that descended on the market. Your better mousetrap was quickly followed by 2 more just like it, both claiming to be better than the first one. Competition was fierce and not always honest. It got so bad that one product manager was overheard to say, "Wouldn't you know it? Last year we had nothing to say, so we put new and improved on the package. This year the research people came up with a real improvement, and we don't know what to say." The image era. The next phase was the image era. Successful companies found that reputation, or image, was more important in selling a product than any specific product feature. The architect of the image era was David Ogilvy. As he said in his famous speech on the subject, every advertisement is a long-term investment in the image of a brand. And he proved the validity of his ideas with programs for Hathaway shirts, Rolls-Royce, Schweppes, and others. But just as the Me Too products killed the product era, the Me Too companies killed the image era. As every company tried to establish a reputation for itself, the noise level became so high that relatively few companies succeeded. And of the ones that made it, most did it primarily with spectacular technical achievements, not spectacular advertising. Xerox and Polaroid, to name 2. The positioning era. Today it has become obvious that advertising is entering a new era, an era where creativity is no longer the key to success. The fun and games of the 60s and 70s have given way to the harsh realities of the 80s. To succeed in our over-communicated society, a company must create a position in the prospect's mind, a position that takes into consideration not only a company's own strengths and weaknesses, but those of its competitors as well. Advertising is entering an era where strategy is king. In the positioning era, it's not enough to invent or discover something. It may not even be necessary. You must, however, be first to get into the prospect's mind. IBM didn't invent the computer. Sperry Rand did. But IBM was the first company to build a computer position in the mind of the prospect. What Amerigo discovered. The Sperry Rand of the 15th century was Christopher Columbus. As every schoolchild knows, the man who discovered America was poorly rewarded for his efforts. Christopher Columbus made the mistake of looking for gold and keeping his mouth shut. Amerigo Vespucci didn't. The IBM of the 15th century, Amerigo was 5 years behind Christopher. But he did two things right. First, he positioned the New World as a separate continent, totally distinct from Asia. This caused a revolution in the geography of his day. Second, he wrote extensively of his discoveries and theories. Especially significant are the 5 letters of his third voyage. 1. Mundus Novus, was translated into 40 different languages over a 25-year period. Before he died, Spain granted him Castilian citizenship and gave him a major state post. As a result, the Europeans credited Amerigo Vespucci with the discovery of America and named the place after him. Christopher Columbus died in jail. What Michelob discovered. The great copywriters of yesterday, who have gone to the big ad agency in the sky, would die all over again if they saw some of the campaigns currently running. Take beer advertising, for example. In the past, a beer copywriter looked closely at the product to find a copy platform. And he or she found product features like real draft peels and cold brewed Ballantine. And even further back, a beer copywriter searched for just the right words to paint a picture of quality, taste, and appetite appeal. Just a kiss of the hops. From the land of sky blue waters. Today, however, poetry in advertising is as dead as poetry in poetry. One of the biggest advertising successes of recent times is the campaign for Michelob. The brand was launched with a campaign that is as poetic as a stop sign. And just as effective. First Class is Michelob, positioned the brand as a premium-priced American-made beer. In a few years, Michelob became one of the largest-selling beers in the United States. At premium prices too. Was Michelob the first premium-priced domestic beer? No, of course not. But Michelob was the first to build the position in the beer drinker's mind. What Miller discovered. Notice how the poetry in the old Schlitz beer slogan hides the positioning. Real gusto in a great, light beer. Did anyone out there in the neighborhood bar and grill believe that Schlitz was any lighter than Budweiser or Pabst? No, the Schlitz slogan made as much sense to the Joe Sixpacks of this world as the lyrics in an Italian opera. But over at the Miller Brewing Company, they apparently asked themselves what would happen if they really positioned a beer as a light beer. So Miller introduced light beer. And the rest is history. A runaway success that spawned a host of Me Too brands. Including, ironically, Schlitz Light. Presumably to be promoted as real gusto in a great, light beer. For many people or products today, one roadway to success is to look at what your competitors are doing and then subtract the poetry or creativity which has become a barrier to getting the message into the mind. With a purified and simplified message, you can then penetrate the prospect's mind. For example, there's an imported beer whose positioning strategy is so crystal clear that those old-time beer copywriters probably wouldn't even accept it as advertising. You've tasted the German beer that's the most popular in America. Now taste the German beer that's the most popular in Germany. This is how Beck's beer effectively positioned itself against Löwenbräu. Advertising like this made Beck's beer popular in America too. Sales kept going up year after year. Löwenbräu, on the other hand, gave up the struggle and became a domestic brand. Strange things have been happening in American advertising. It's becoming less poetic and more effective. 4. Those little ladders in your head. To better understand what your message is up against, let's take a closer look at the ultimate objective of all communication, the human mind. Like the memory bank of a computer, the mind has a slot or position for each bit of information it has chosen to retain. In operation, the mind is a lot like a computer. But there is one important difference. A computer has to accept what you put into it. The mind does not. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The mind rejects new information that doesn't compute. It accepts only that new information which matches its current state of mind. It filters out everything else. You see what you expect to see. Take any two abstract drawings. Write the name Schwartz on one and the name Picasso on the other. Then ask someone for an opinion. You see what you expect to see. Ask two people of opposite persuasion, say, a Democrat and a Republican, to read an article on a controversial subject. Then ask each one if the article changed his or her opinion. You'll find that the Democrat gets out of the article facts to support one point of view. The Republican gets out of the same article facts to support the opposite point of view. Very little mind changing takes place. You see what you expect to see. Pour a bottle of Gallo into an empty 50-year-old bottle of French Burgundy. Then carefully decant a glass in front of a friend and ask for an opinion. You taste what you expect to taste. Blind taste testings of champagne have often ranked inexpensive California brands above French ones. With the labels on, this is unlikely to happen. You taste what you expect to taste. Were it not so, there would be no role for advertising at all. Were the average consumer rational instead of emotional, there would be no advertising. At least not as we know it today. One prime objective of all advertising is to heighten expectations. To create the illusion that the product or service will perform the miracles you expect. And presto, that's exactly what the advertising does. But create the opposite expectation and the product is in trouble. The introductory advertising for Gablinger's beer created a feeling that because it was a diet product, it would taste bad. And sure enough, the advertising worked. People tried it and were easily convinced that it did taste bad. You taste what you expect to taste. An inadequate container. Not only does the human mind reject information which does not match its prior knowledge or experience, it doesn't have much prior knowledge or experience to work with. In our overcommunicated society, the human mind is a totally inadequate container. According to Harvard psychologist Dr. George A. Miller, the average human mind cannot deal with more than 7 units at a time. Which is why 7 is a popular number for lists that have to be remembered. 7-digit phone numbers, the 7 wonders of the world, 7-card stud, Snow White, and the 7 dwarfs. Ask someone to name all the brands he or she remembers in a given product category. Rarely will anyone name more than 7. And that's for a high-interest category. For low-interest products, the average consumer can usually name no more than 1 or 2 brands. Try listing all 10 of the 10 commandments. If that's too difficult, how about the 7 danger signals of cancer? Or the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse? In one newspaper survey, 80 out of 100 Americans couldn't name a single member of the president's cabinet. If our mental storage bowl is too small to handle questions like these, how in the world are we going to keep track in our mind of all those brand names which have been multiplying like rabbits over the years? 30 years ago the 6 leading cigarette companies between them offered the American smoker 17 different brands. Today they sell more than 175. A vending machine built to hold all these brands would have to be 30 feet long. Modelitis has struck every industry, from automobiles to beer to zoom lenses. Detroit currently sells 290 different models in a bewildering variety of styles and sizes. Caravelle, Capri, Cimarron, Camaro, Calais. Cutlass. Let's see, is it a Chevrolet Caravelle or a Plymouth Caravelle? The public is confused. To cope with complexity, people have learned to simplify everything. When asked to describe an offspring's intellectual progress, a person doesn't usually quote vocabulary, statistics, reading comprehension, mathematical ability, etc. He's in 7th grade, is a typical reply. This ranking of people, objects, and brands is not only a convenient method of organizing things but also an absolute necessity to keep from being overwhelmed by the complexities of life. The product ladder. To cope with the product explosion, people have learned to rank products and brands in the mind. Perhaps this can best be visualized by imagining a series of ladders in the mind. On each step is a brand name. And each different ladder represents a different product category. Some ladders have many steps. 7 is many. Others have few, if any. A competitor that wants to increase its share of the business must either dislodge the brand above, a task that is usually impossible, or somehow relate its brand to the other company's position. Yet too many companies embark on marketing and advertising programs as if the competitor's position did not exist. They advertise their products in a vacuum and are disappointed when their messages fail to get through. Moving up the ladder in the mind can be extremely difficult if the brands above have a strong foothold and no leverage or positioning strategy is applied. An advertiser who wants to introduce a new product category must carry in a new ladder. This, too, is difficult, especially if the new category is not positioned against the old one. The mind has no room for what's new and different unless it's related to the old. That's why if you have a truly new product, it's often better to tell the prospect what the product is not, rather than what it is. The first automobile, for example, was called a horseless carriage, a name which allowed the public to position the concept against the existing mode of transportation. Words like off-track betting, lead-free gasoline, and sugar-free soda are all examples of how new concepts can best be positioned against the old. The against position. In today's marketplace, the competitor's position is just as important as your own. Sometimes more important. An early success in the positioning era was the famous Avis campaign. The Avis campaign will go down in marketing history as a classic example of establishing the against position. In the case of Avis, this was a position against the leader. Avis is only number 2 in rent-a-cars, so why go with us? We try harder. For 13 years in a row, Avis lost money. Then they admitted that they were number 2 and Avis started to make money. The first year Avis made $1.2 million. The second year, $2.6 million. The third year, $5 million. Then the company was sold to ITT. Avis was able to make substantial gains because they recognized the position of Hertz and didn't try to attack them head-on. To better understand why the Avis program was so successful, let's look into the mind of the prospect and imagine we can see a product ladder marked rent-a-cars. On each rung of the product ladder is a brand name. Hertz on top. Avis on the second rung. National on the third. Many marketing people have misread the Avis story. They assume the company was successful because it tried harder. Not at all. Avis was successful because it related itself to Hertz. If trying harder were the secret of success, Harold Stassen would have been president many times over. As an indication of how far the advertising business has come in its acceptance of comparative ads, Time magazine originally rejected the "we try harder" line as being too competitive with Hertz. Other magazines followed the Time lead. So the account executive panicked and agreed to change the line to "we try damned hard." A curse word. Presumably being less offensive than a comparative word. Only after the ad was cancelled did Time change its mind and agree to accept the original version. The account executive was fired. Establishing the against position is a classic positioning maneuver. If a company isn't the first, then it has to be the first to occupy the number 2 position. It's not an easy task. But it can be done. What Avis is doing in rent-a-cars, Burger King is doing in fast foods, and Pepsi is doing in colas. The uncola position. Another classic positioning strategy is to worm your way onto a ladder owned by someone else. As 7-Up did. The brilliance of this idea can only be appreciated when you comprehend the enormous share of mind enjoyed by Coke and Pepsi. Almost 2 out of every 3 soft drinks consumed in the United States are cola drinks. By linking the product to what was already in the mind of the prospect, the uncola position established 7-Up as an alternative to a cola drink. The 3 rungs on the cola ladder might be visualized as 1. Coke, 2. Pepsi, and 3. 7-Up. To prove the universality of positioning concepts, McCormick Communications took beautiful music radio station WLKW, and also ran in the Providence, Rhode Island, market, and made it number 1. Their theme. WLKW, the unrock station. To find a unique position, you must ignore conventional logic. Conventional logic says you find your concept inside yourself or inside the product. Not true. What you must do is look inside the prospect's mind. You won't find an uncola idea inside a 7-Up can. You find it inside the cola drinker's head. The F.W.M.T.S. trap. More than anything else, successful positioning requires consistency. You must keep at it year after year. Yet after a company has executed a brilliant positioning coup, too often it falls into what we call the F.W.M.T.S. trap, forgot what made them successful. Shortly after the company was sold to ITT, Avis decided it was no longer satisfied with being number 2. So it ran ads saying, "Avis is going to be no one." That's advertising your aspirations. Wrong psychologically. And wrong strategically. Avis was not destined to be number 1 unless it could find a weakness in Hertz to exploit. Furthermore, the old campaign not only related number 2 Avis to number 1 Hertz on the product ladder in the prospect's mind, but also capitalized on the natural sympathy people have for the underdog. The new campaign was just conventional brag and boast advertising. Be honest. In the last 20 years, Avis has run many different advertising campaigns, the Wizard of Avis. You don't have to run through airports. But what is the single theme that leaps into your mind when someone mentions Avis? Of course, Avis is only number 2, etc. Yet Avis in the last few years has consistently ignored the only concept it really owns in the mind. Someday when National Rent-A-Car passes Avis in sales, Avis will appreciate the value of the number 2 concept it lost. If you want to be successful today, you can't ignore the competitor's position. Nor can you walk away from your own. In the immortal words of Joan Didion, play it as it lays. 5. You can't get there from here. There's an old story about a traveler who asked a farmer for directions to a nearby town. The farmer replied, "Well, you go down the road for a mile, turn left at the fork." "No, that won't work." "You turn around and drive for half a mile till you hit a stop sign, then turn right," the farmer continued. "No, that won't work either." After a long pause, the farmer looked at the confused traveler and said, "You know what, son, you can't get there from here. That just happens to be the fate of many people, politicians, and products today. They happen to be in a position where they can't get there from here. Avis is not going to be number 1. Wishing won't make it so. And neither will massive amounts of advertising. The can-do spirit refuses to die. In many ways our country's Vietnam experience was a typical example of American can-do spirit. Anything is possible if only you try hard enough. But no matter how hard we tried, no matter how many soldiers and how much money we poured in, the problem could not be solved by an outside force. We couldn't get there from here. In spite of hundreds of Vietnam examples to the contrary, we live in a can-do environment. Yet many things are not possible, no matter how hard you try. Take the 55-year-old executive vice president who is never going to get the top job. When the chief executive retires in a few years at age 65, the board appoints a 48-year-old successor. The 55-year-old is out of phase for the president's job. To have a chance for promotion, he or she must be at least a decade younger than the current holder. In the battle for the mind, the same thing often happens to the product that's out of phase. Today a company can have a great product, a great sales force, a great advertising campaign and still fail miserably if it happens to be in a position in which you can't get there from here. No matter how many millions it is prepared to spend. And the best example is what happened to RCA in the computer business. The handwriting on the wall. In 1969 we wrote an article for Industrial Marketing magazine using RCA as one of the prime examples. Entitled, "Positioning is a Game People Play in Today's Me Too Marketplace," the article pulled no punches. It named names and made predictions, all based on the rules of a game called positioning. It was the first time anyone had used the word positioning to describe the process of coping with the mental position that a larger, more established competitor occupies. One prediction, in particular, turned out to be strikingly accurate. As far as the computer industry was concerned, we wrote, a company has no hope to make progress head-on against the position that IBM has established. The operative word, of course, was head-on. And while it's possible to compete successfully with a market leader, the article suggested several approaches. The rules of positioning say it can't be done head-on. Back in 1969 this raised a few eyebrows. Who were we to say that a powerful, multi-billion-dollar company like RCA couldn't find happiness in the computer business if it so desired? So as 1970 rolled around, it was full speed ahead at RCA. The incredible story was told in the pages of the business press. RCA fires a broadside at no one, said the headline of an article in the September 19, 1970, issue of Business Week. RCA goes head-to-head with IBM, said the headline of a news item in the October 1970 issue of Fortune. RCA Computer pushes head-on / at IBM, said the headline of a story in the October 26, 1970, issue of Advertising Age. And just to make sure there was no mistaking the company's intentions, Robert W. Sarnoff, chairman and president, made a prediction that by the end of 1970, RCA would be in a firm number 2 position in the computer industry, pointing out that his company had already invested far more to develop a strong position in the early 70s. The can-do spirit dies. Less than a year later, the roof fell in. The $250 million disaster that hit RCA, said the headline of a story in the September 25, 1971, issue of Business Week. That's a lot of dough. Someone figured out that if you took that much money in $100 bills and put it on the sidewalk in Rockefeller Center, the stack would go right past Bob Sarnoff's window on the 53rd floor of the RCA building. Those were bad times for computer manufacturers. In May 1970, after years of unprofitable computer operations, General Electric threw in the sponge by selling the mess to Honeywell. With two major computer manufacturers folding one right after another, the urge to say, "I told you so," was irresistible. So later in the year 1971, we came back with, Positioning Revisited, Why Didn't GE and RCA Listen? The article appeared in the November 1971 issue of Industrial Marketing. How do you advertise and market against a company like IBM? The two positioning articles made some suggestions. How to go against an IBM. The computer business has often been referred to as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Snow White has established a position unrivaled in the history of marketing. IBM has 70% of the mainframe computer business versus less than 10% for the largest of the dwarfs. How do you go against a company with a position like IBM? Well, first you have to recognize it. Then you don't do the thing that too many people in the computer field try to do. Act like IBM. A company has no hope to make progress head-on against the position that IBM has established. And history, so far, has proved this to be true. The small companies in the field probably recognize this. But the big companies seem to think they can take their strong positions against IBM. Well, as one unhappy executive was heard to say, there just isn't enough money in the world. You can't get there from here. Fight fire with fire is the old cliche. But as the late Howard Gossage used to say, that's silly. You fight fire with water. A better strategy for IBM's competitors would be to take advantage of whatever positions they already own in the minds of their prospects and then relate them to a new position in computers. For example, how should RCA have positioned its computer line? Our 1969 article made a suggestion. RCA is a leader in communications. If they positioned a computer line that related to their business in communications, they could take advantage of their own position. Even though they would be ignoring a great deal of business, they would be establishing a strong beachhead. Take General Electric, a company that is a big user of computers. Time sharing was the big technological topic of the day. If GE had concentrated on time-sharing computers, they too might have succeeded in the computer field. Actually, the only computer operation General Electric didn't sell to Honeywell was their time-sharing network, which remains profitable to this day. Take NCR, a company with a strong position in cash registers. NCR has made great progress in the computer business by concentrating its efforts on retail data entry systems. Computerized cash registers, if you will. Where the situation is hopeless, however, the effort in finding a valid position is probably wasted. Much better to concentrate on other areas of a company's business. As Charlie Brown said, no problem is too big to run away from. In truth, outright failure is often preferable to mediocre success. An also-ran can easily be tempted to think that the answer to the problem is trying harder. A company stuck with a losing position is not going to benefit much from hard work. The problem is not what, but when, the extra effort, if it is going to be of much help, should be applied early to establish the precious posture of product leadership. With it, everything is possible. Without it, the going is going to be rough indeed. As the Eskimo remarked, the lead dog is the only one who enjoys a change of view. Smith and Jones at General Electric. One example might help illustrate the principle. Two gentlemen had their eyes on the top job at General Electric. One was named Smith. The other was named Jones. Smith was your typical can-do corporate executive. So when he was given the computer operation to run, he accepted the assignment with relish. Jones, on the other hand, was realistic. He knew that GE hadn't gotten into the computer business early enough to dominate it. At this late stage of the game, it was going to cost the company too much to catch up to IBM. If it ever could. After Smith failed to turn the computer business around, Jones got a chance to participate. He recommended that General Electric get out of the computer business, which it eventually did by selling the operation to Honeywell. That's one reason why Reginald H. Jones wound up as chief executive of the General Electric Company. J. Stanford Smith wound up at International Paper. In a nutshell, the hierarchy in the computer business is duplicated in almost every other industry. Invariably, every industry has a strong leader: IBM in computers, Xerox in copiers, and General Motors in automobiles, and a host of also-rans. If one can understand the role of positioning in the computer industry, then one can transfer this knowledge to almost any other situation. What works for computers will also work for cars and for colas. Or vice versa.